question I always ask everybody I interview is a question that kind of takes you all the way back to the beginning of your journey. And that is where you're from. I mean, it's kind of obvious from your accent. Someone could tell where you're from, but, you know, tell me where you're from.
I'm from Australia, and I've been here in the US. It's 6 years this month, actually. I came and started my ministry life almost to the day 6 years ago. But I'm from a city about 1.5 million called Brisbane, Australia. It's on the middle of the East Coast, and it's subtropical. So very similar climate to a place like Hawaii or Baton Rouge in the summer. It's not as cold in the winter though. So,
well, I'm going to ask you some questions about your adjustment from Australia to Louisiana. But first, I want to ask you this question. I was just thinking about the fact that a lot of the people I've interviewed have been from fairly lesser known countries like Belgium, Sierra Leone, countries that you don't always think of at first glance. But then I've also interviewed some people from some fairly well-known places like France and the UK, and Australia is one of those very well-known countries. I mean, when I think about the predominance of Australia in pop culture, I think about just in music, I think the Bee Gees are Australian, Kylie Minogue is Australian. I think about Hollywood, you know, Hugh Jackman, Nicole Kidman, you know, Australia, and also, you know, the most stereotypical depiction of an Australian is Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter. But I feel like there should be a lot more to Australia than just those very stereotypical or Hollywood-esque kind of depictions. Like Australia is a country of human beings like America is. So tell me what it was like growing up in Australia from your perspective.
Yes, this is a great observation. We're having a good run too with the Hemsworth brothers right now. So thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yes, Australia is a very rich and diverse country. And I mean, I must confess that I didn't really realize the gift of that diversity until I left. I actually left Australia for Hawaii in 2015 and discovered that was the first time I lived as a ethnic minority in Hawaii, because it's predominantly Asian and Polynesian culture in Hawaii. And I realized that I lived in a very, very sheltered upbringing in Australia in the 1980s, you know, lower middle class, suburban culture, which was very, very culturally English. I'm not sure how many people realize that European culture is much stronger there than you might think, and English culture, particularly in my upbringing, was very, very strong. And so my grandparents would correct me for any rogue Americanisms that would sort of sneak into my use of the language, you know, like saying hurricane instead of hurricane, and these little things like that was sort of seen as, you know, some invading foreign American force. I think of Australia as very multicultural, and that's talked about a lot. But I think it's a little bit like the mainland of the US, that often we can live these isolated lives where we only come across other cultures when we go to get takeout. And I'm terribly overwhelmed by that thought now that I'm an adult, and realized how sheltered and how racist often some of my upbringing was.
I know Australia is very different from the US, but there are similarities in terms of history and similarities geographically. America is fairly isolated in the world, and I think Australia is a little bit so, but not quite, because Australia, I know, is closer to Asia than America is, but also another shared history is the indigenous peoples that preceded the settlers. So we had indigenous peoples. I know Australia had indigenous peoples, and a pretty ugly history shared between those two countries. And also Australia and the US are very multicultural. A lot of people immigrated to what I know Australia, and also a lot of people immigrated to America as well. But I guess the question I have is, you know, most people probably aren't going to think of diversity when they think of Australia. So what are some other misconceptions that a lot of people outside of Australia may have of Australia?
Yes, the diversity is an important one, and something that Australia is starting to grapple with more and more, I think, now. And it's bringing a richness to the culture like never before. I don't think Australia really woke up to the idea of it being part of the Asian Pacific region really until the 60s and the 70s. And so that's very, very new in terms of the culture. And that's still something that we're living into. I think a lot of people don't realize that the Aboriginal people of Australia are around 40 to 60,000 years they've been on those lands, and makes them one of the most ancient cultures to live in their original native country. And there's a diversity and a richness of those peoples, thousands of different tribes and languages. And I'm still learning about that every day and every time I reconnect with my country. Australia is, as you say, a nation of exports. You know, we export people all over the world, but I think also it as well as sort of punching above its weight in terms of Hollywood and sport and swimming, for example, and tennis, we think of Australians as being very good at. They're very innovative. The diving equipment that was used to explore the Titanic, for example, was all Australian made. And so there's amazing scientific community there, which is very diverse and rich and a global thing to be proud of, I think.
Wait, repeat. What was made? What did Australia make? Yeah.
The submarine equipment and the diving equipment that James Cameron used to explore the Titanic wreck is all Australian made. And,
I thought you were talking about the Titanic ship.
Oh no, not the ship itself, but to explore it. Yeah, so that's one example of the connection with the ocean, being an island nation. We think of the Great Barrier Reef maybe as a tourist attraction, but what is it that drives innovation around that? That's one example, good example of that.
Okay, that's pretty cool too. I have to admit that I have not seen the Titanic film. I mean, I've heard the main song by Celine Dion, but I have not actually watched a single second of the movie.
It was pretty cool. It was a real cultural phenomenon when I was growing up. And what fascinated me about it too is that James Cameron has a real interest and love of the history and went and rediscovered the wreck and filmed it. And as someone who loves history, who grew up going antiquing with his father and so on as a young boy, you know, all of that stuff sort of gets me sort of excited. There's a richness to that.
Well, let's get into your history, because I know that you mentioned going to Hawaii from Australia. And by the way, I actually had a chance to look at your blog and read some of your posts. So I do have some questions about different things that you've written. But I want you to walk me through your journey of going from Australia to Hawaii. And was that the first American place that you had visited or been to?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have a couple of US threads. My father actually met his stepmother online back in the mid-90s when it was not the done thing. And she's from Denver, Colorado. So I was living with an American once my dad got remarried at the age of 14. And you know, my joke is that I discovered that they weren't like Americans weren't like they are on TV, because in Australia, you often only get the only in America stories, you know, whether it be like a 30-foot alligator, you know, coming up someone's driveway in Florida, or some awful mass shooting, or some story about, you know, oversized thick shakes at McDonald's or something like that. You know, the larger the life sort of stereotypical America is often what you get on TV. But in my stepmother, I found someone who was you know, loving and kind and intellectually stimulating, and came from a culture which was just as rich and diverse as perhaps Australian culture is in its different ways. And And so once I finally got back to seminary after taking a break, leaving school, and working for 4 or 5, 6 years or so. And when I headed back to seminary, I had a chance to get a scholarship to do some travel just before I was ordained a deacon and then a priest. And other scholarship winners, they chose the UK, and there's a lot of cultural connections and roots between Australia and the UK. But I was always headed to the US. That was my passion, my love. And my wife and I, Julia, we were newly married. My wife was pregnant with our first child. It was my very first overseas trip. And we spent 6 weeks on the US mainland and just fell in love with the culture, the diversity, and the particular expression of Christian identity, which is in the Episcopal Church too.
What were some cool places that you visited when you were traveling in America on your scholarship?
It was a scholarship to look at environmental justice and sustainability issues, and how churches might help out and be missional about that. I visited some really cool projects up in Sonoma County, for example, where parishes were going out and gleaning abandoned apple orchards and giving the produce away, or making jam and selling it to resource low-income communities in their neighborhoods. I went to a church in LA which had really prided itself on this like pristine, beautiful lawn, and they decided we're going to rip up the front lawn in front of the church and build a community garden right on the doorstep of the church, and do cooking classes for those in the community who were just, had not learned good eating habits and cooking habits and so on. So there's a real range of projects like that were innovative and unique, and really gave me a hope that individual local communities could like make an environmental impact.
I also had a chance to read your blog and saw that you went to the East Coast as well.
I did. Yeah, that's right. I visited New York and DC. I must admit, I'd always dreamed of a white Christmas in New York. Maybe too much watching Home Alone or something like that. But I
mean, that was my movie growing up. Yeah, because I always watched it, and I always wished that I was Kevin. I was like, who would leave their kid in New York City of all places and just forget? Like, that couldn't be me. But the whole idea of just Home Alone 1 and Lost in New York, those are like one of my favorite movies two of my favorite movies growing up. So
yeah. I can relate to that for sure. I just rewatched them with the kids. My children are now 8 and 9, so it's like the perfect age for them to be watching those. And yeah, I mean, I went to this amazing church in up Manhattan, like 175th Street, something up there, called the Church of the Intercession. A very interesting, racially diverse congregation, which originally started as a chapel to Trinity Wall Street, which was at the time the very white, very affluent, upper class church, and they planted this mission church for then the slaves, and then African American and other cultures. But now this church has become its own parish, its own mission, and it's of itself, and reflects the local community, of West Harlem. And it was an eye-opening experience just to be there. And one of the striking things about that visit is that the priest, I've never seen this done before, invited people to say the Lord's Prayer very quietly and very intentionally in the language that they were most comfortable with. And so there were all these people saying the Lord's Prayer, which was so familiar to them in their own native tongue, as it were. And it was a beautiful moment of diversity and unity at the same time.
So you had a chance to really do some amazing things traveling to America. And I also like the fact that you chose a place that was different and a place that also was misunderstood. Because if you only judge America based on those things you see on the news or the things you see in movies, then you only get to see an America that is very one-sided, very complicated and completely insane. And you miss the fact that we have a rich history and that every part of America is like extremely diverse and extremely eclectic. I mean, you went to LA, you went to Sonoma County, you went to NY, you went to DC, and also you went to Hawaii. And Hawaii is like worlds apart, literally, from the mainland US. And from what I understood, you actually did some ordained work in Hawaii. So tell me about what it was like being in Hawaii. And then also, what are some differences between ministry, I guess, Episcopalian practice in Australia compared to perhaps your initial experiences doing that work in Hawaii?
Hawaii is, again, a place which is often thought in a very particular way. You know, we think of Waikiki, we think of surfing, and all those things are true. But one of the things I say about Hawaii is that aloha is real. You know, it's a real thing. It's something that permeates the islands, in the environment, in the waterfalls, and when you go hiking, you can feel this you know, I would say a mysterious force of love and hospitality, and what they call ohana, you know, of family. The striking thing about Hawaii and living there, and I touched on the racial diversity before, and I said it was the first time for me living as an ethnic minority. You know, they call, sometimes white people are called haoles. Sometimes it's meant as a derogatory phrase, but it's not always, particularly if you use it as of yourself. And I'd often catch public transport and be the only white person on the bus. And for me, growing up in such a culture which was such the opposite, and it's the first time for my children to go to a school where there's predominantly people were from a different cultural background to them, that were bringing different things in their lunch boxes to them. You know, all the things that we read about diversity and experiencing it from the other point of view. That was something that I got to experience just for a few years myself. The other thing is that every culture there, in my experience, jokes about and makes fun of the sort of tropes of their individual culture. You know, the Chinese person or the Portuguese person proudly talks about their race openly and often makes fun of it. And maybe there's some stereotypes of those certain particular cultures. And I joked about calling myself a haole. You know, what do I know? I'd say, you know, I'm just a haole, you know. And that's one way of saying to people there who are local, you know, I'm just an outsider. You know, I'm not coming here as a tourist, but I'm also realizing that I'm an outsider. So there was something really wonderful about the way that they interacted with race. And the many questions that we're having, and the struggles that we're having on the mainland, don't come into play, but because the African American community in Hawaii is very, very small. And so the different types of questions, the questions much more are around, what does it mean to be a Hawaiian people, as in a native Hawaiian people? And as I understand it from their point of view, what is it for them to rediscover their own culture through their own eyes, rather than through white eyes or through tourist eyes or something like that? So it's amazing to watch that journey as people start to relearn Hawaiian, for example, who they were told in the 20s and 30s that they had to be more American, and therefore they weren't allowed to speak Hawaiian. You know, you'll hear overtones of that on the mainland too, from people who are told not to speak Spanish or another language. But it's a fascinating place to do ministry.
I have not gone to Hawaii, but I mean, with it being an American state that I'm pretty aware exists, and also in graduate school, which is an interesting intersection that I wanted to point out earlier that you made. My graduate school actually was on an former apple orchard in New England, so that was pretty cool. And one of my classmates and close friends is from Honolulu. But she's white, but she's from Honolulu. So that's an interesting thing that you mentioned about being an ethnic minority in Hawaii, because I would also be an ethnic minority in Hawaii, which isn't really surprising because I'm an ethnic minority everywhere I go in America. But in Hawaii, I will be an ethnic minority in a community that has mostly Asian and indigenous people that live in that community. So that's really interesting to bring up.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about what you said about Hawaii having to kind of renegotiate or reconcile its history, because Hawaii was a kingdom. Hawaii had a whole civilization and kingdom before
Yes.
America came and kind of overthrew the queen and created and colonized Hawaii, and then eventually became a state. So Hawaii has a rich history before America even kind of stepped into quote unquote colonize it, for lack of a better word. But the things you're talking about that Hawaiians went through in terms of having a culture and then being forced to confront that in the face of this waspification of America, you know, similar to what happened with the Cajuns and Creoles in Louisiana. You know, they had a cult. Granted, Cajuns have mostly been seen as white and Creoles are of various races, but, you know, in the 20th century, a lot of French-speaking people in Louisiana were basically penalized legally and socially for speaking French. And so that resulted in a death of that predominance. I mean, I actually was interviewing someone recently who said that in 1970, there were 1 million people in Louisiana who spoke French. And it was during this time that Codafil and a lot of Francophone organizations wanted to kind of revitalize that French culture. But most culture is passed by the elders. And when the elders stopped passing on French to their children, then the French language population went from 1 million to 200,000 in Louisiana. And so now there's the rush to bring it back. And I think that's similar with Hawaiian. I mean, people are now trying to teach and get Hawaiian to be more predominant. And even on Duolingo, you can learn Hawaiian on Duolingo. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But since we're talking about diversity and the differences of America within its history, you went from a place where there were very few Black people and white people, and you went to the South, which not only has a way more Black and white people than Hawaii, but also has a much messier, if not just as messy history with race as Hawaii does. But I think probably the South has an even messier history because of Jim Crow and so many other things. So walk me through your journey of going from Hawaii to going to Louisiana, which those two states alone are like worlds apart.
They are worlds apart in many, many ways. You touched on the racial differences there. And of course, the questions here in Louisiana are, the predominant one, of course, for me is what does it mean for my church and the rectory, the parish provided housing that I'm in right now, to be on a former slave plantation? You know, what does that mean? And what does that mean when we're a predominantly white church and a church which comes from a predominantly white Anglo culture? You know, the Episcopal Church is the name for the Church of England in the United States after independence. The English church wouldn't ordain bishops for the American church after independence. And so the American church here went to Scotland, and the Scottish Episcopal Church ordained the first bishop, Bishop Seabury. And that's why we ended up with the name Episcopal Church. But you know, it started as a establishment church, you know, in the 13 colonies. And so that's something the Episcopal Church struggles with to reconcile. I know that Virginia Theological Seminary was in part slave built, and that they're doing a lot of work to reconcile and not even to reconcile, to grapple with what that means, you know, to make small steps. I know the University of the South, Sewanee, which our diocese is a co-owner of, is also, you know, making steps to wrestle with the complicity of the church's history in that. And so what I've tried to do is you know, just to educate myself and to listen, to do some reading, to attend courses. Like I attended a wonderful weekend course by the Crossroads organization out of Chicago, which deals very forcefully and intentionally and really in your face way with U.S. American history, and looks at how many things of the country are linked to inequality, racism, and injustice. So that's something which, again, it's an interesting thing for me as an Australian, because I always remain an expat, but I still believe in the idea of a country and a people that can find itself anew, whether it be Australia trying to reconcile its history as a colonial outpost in which the country was stolen for an indigenous people, and the land was called falsely terra nullius. It was called vacant land falsely when the white Europeans arrived in Australia. You mentioned Hawaii before. There's no avoiding that Hawaii is an annexed nation with an overthrown kingdom, as you mentioned, that their queen was enslaved. And of course, at the height of the American and Spanish wars, at the height of white industrial wealth, when it comes to plantation, sugar cane and pineapple plantations. And so there is a connection there culturally between this idea of using others to create my wealth. And that's why I see the biggest connection between Louisiana and Hawaii, because fundamentally it wasn't the native people or the workers who were making the wealth. In both places, the workers and enslaved people on the mainland, and the workers who were very poorly paid in Hawaii, they were discouraged to get along, so that the white landowners could always hold up a hand. My question is, where does that leave me as someone who is charged with often pastorally caring for a very white congregation, a very white community? And I think for me, it's just continuing to encourage people to ask those questions and to read widely and to not ignore that history, which is very complicated.
The intersections between Australia's history and American history, more so parallels rather, are eerily similar because of the fact that those conversations are being had to this day about the fact that both countries exist because of colonialism, and they were originally the place of inhabitants for indigenous peoples. And a lot of our treatment of indigenous peoples, Americans and Australians, has been frankly horrible. And then also for the fact that even now there are a lot of debates and conversations happening in Australia, from what I read in the news, and also conversations had in America with regards to refugees and immigrants and indigenous folks that are very similar. The thing, same attitudes on both sides of the equation, both same approaches, even the same strategies for dealing with it, positive and negative. One question I want to ask is this question about religion, because I know in many other countries, especially more secular countries, religion and politics are very much separated. France is a country that prides itself on being secular, and a lot of European countries pride themselves on being very much secular. And America is a secular country. We don't have a state religion, but we have a lot of intersections with religion and politics, especially when it comes to social issues, political issues. And sometimes these religious conversations can get very messy and can sometimes be very problematic, in my opinion. So as an Australian expat and also as a religious leader, what is your opinion on these intersections of religion and politics? And do you all have the same issue or same conversations in Australia with regards to that intersection?
Yeah, I think messy is a good starting point. I think religion in general and being a minister of religion or a priest in general is treated very differently in the US, particularly in the South, than it is in Australia. Australia have gone the way of the UK and parts of Europe and become a very secular nation. I think Australia is a place where I would turn up, even in a country town, which is sort of fairly conservative, maybe nominally Christian and religious. And people would ask me whether I was in fancy dress costume when I'd be out and about, you know. They'd be like, oh, you know, Halloween is not, you know, coming up. They really didn't understand. And therefore there was no language, you know, let alone they didn't know who to call me or what to call me or what to make of me, particularly when I was even younger than I am now, because I was ordained about 10 years ago now. But they wouldn't know the why. They you know, they wouldn't know the how. They didn't know any sort of practicalities often about religion beyond a wedding and a funeral. That was their only sort of thought process about religion. I've been struck as I've moved to Baton Rouge and to the South of how much religion is part of the culture. I think we saw that today in the inauguration, you know, the swearing on of the Bible, you know, the prayers for the president, you know, after, and so on. It's just part and parcel of American public life in a way which is just very, very foreign to someone in Australia. In Australia, we joke about don't talk about religion in politics, but Australians really mean it. They really don't want you to talk about those things if you go to someone's place for dinner. I'll go to a non-parish function rather, and people would ask me what I did if I wasn't in a collar, and often it would be, you know, I'd say I study theology, and they'd be like, oh, philosophy. I'm no theology, you know, oh, what is that? You know, I have to explain it. But here, religion is woven into the fabric here in a way which is, as you say, it's very hard to tease out. And I think that's a very positive thing and a very negative thing. In a positive sense, it means that you've got a starting point as a priest of some shared cultural knowledge. There'll be like some awareness of the Christian narratives or some awareness of church and beyond just what they see on TV. But the negative side of it is that what you're alluding to before, that often a Christian response to politics is only seen a very particular way, you know. And I think that from my reading and my understanding, the increasingly troubling trend of right-wing politics getting connected with a very, you know, extreme fundamentalist evangelical religion. You know, I see religious extremism of any religion to be highly problematic, highly irrational, and you know, in many cases dangerous. And so one of the things I hope to do as being an Episcopalian and one who's still trying to figure out these questions of faith and hope and identity for myself is to invite others into those same questions, you know, to not to turn our brains off, to always be rigorously engaged with science, with innovation, with music and the arts and other culture, and those deeper, more challenging questions of race and culture and so on that we touched on before.
When I think about that intersection of religion and politics, I just think about the fact that to say it's problematic or to say that it's amazing is a bit of an incomplete judgment, because, you know, Martin Luther King was a reverend who,
Right.
you know, advocated for civil rights and human rights, and he was very much a very, you know, communitarian leader who believed in radical solutions to address poverty and imperialism and these things that would consider him to be a radical liberal in American politics. And then I'm also thinking about the fact that today you have a lot of, Christian leaders who are leading the charge against climate change, leading the charge against xenophobia, leading the charge against poverty. There's this initiative called the Poor People's Campaign, which is a very, Christian left interpretation of Christianity serving the people and vocalizing. There are even political leaders in Congress who are like, I'm Christian, I was a preacher, I was a minister, but I'm advocating for marginalized people, for vulnerable people, for minorities of various cultures and identities. But then, of course, you do have the other side of that, which is a very right-wing kind of interpretation of it. And what happens is that in politics, that, in my personal opinion, that right-wing interpretation becomes the dominant interpretation of Christianity. I remember thinking about the conversations around the latest Supreme Court Justice Barrett, and how a lot of people were critiquing her interpretation specifically of, her Christianity and how she practiced it and applied it to law. But it was often framed as attacking Christianity. And people were saying, no, like, the guy who's running for president is a Catholic. And we literally are Christians. We just don't believe it the same way that she does. And I didn't really get to see how much of a rift that these interpretations were until, the last couple of years, where we had a lot of different things happen in the community, such as the Alton Sterling, shooting that happened in Baton Rouge, and how I felt like, there were a lot of religious leaders who stepped up, and they were like, hey, this was wrong. And they started really thinking about race and racism. And then you had some that either ignored it or were kind of divisive in a way in which they were themselves kind of racist. And, growing up in the South, I often think about the fact that religion is everywhere, especially in Louisiana, which is South Louisiana is very Catholic, and in other places are very like Bible Belt. And, as someone who was raised Christian, I don't think it's wrong to have a faith tradition. I don't. But I often wonder, is there a way to have a faith tradition, to have a faith system, but to also not use your faith in a way that dehumanizes other people? That's often what I wonder and ask. And that's what I want to ask you, as a religious leader. What do you think about that?
It's ironic, isn't it, that you're asking a question, particularly of Christianity, which says at the core of its gospel, God became human. So we're talking about dehumanizing humanity, which religion, I agree, often does. But at its core, the Christian faith is radical in the most positive sense for me, because it dares to say God became human. That Jesus wasn't just a brilliant teacher, not just a brilliant prophet or part of history, but the radical Christian message is that God was in that person, validating humanity, suffering with humanity, dying and living a new life, a transformed life with humanity. But for me, that means that hope becomes something different than just like a Hallmark card or a political slogan, that hope becomes something which is experienced in a really like grounded, earthy, messy way, which can only be felt and imagined if we wrestle with the tough questions of our own humanity. The questions of how I've been hurt by others, the questions of how I've hurt others, the questions of how my imperfection can give way to a better future for myself and for my family. How am I not going to perpetuate these cycles, for example, for my children and for my neighbors' children? The reclaiming of humanity. And I think if you talk about a very broad political, like hot button issue, like capital punishment, or you talk about a very small scale local issue like the SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps, whatever it might be, if it doesn't humanize and bring compassion, I'm not quite sure it can be called truly Christian in a gospel sense.
One of the earliest events I hosted with my organization was a dialogue on religious identity and Christian privilege. And I remember how powerful it was because it was very raw. It wasn't, politically correct where we were kind of stepping around different things. It was very much out in front. We don't really have those conversations. We don't really talk about the impact religion has on our lives, positively or negatively. And if we talk about that more often, then we can do so without being disrespectful to anybody's faith or lack thereof, but acknowledge that it isn't a neutral thing. Religion often frames itself as an apolitical, neutral body. But I feel personally that if you are looking at the Word of God and you're drawing your own conclusions of it, and human beings interpret the world based on their own experiences. And I think that even if you look at God's word, you can interpret it very different ways and apply that interpretation in different ways. And since human beings are imperfect creatures and organisms, then sometimes that can contribute harm, and we have to have that conversation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think we have plenty of good, common and exciting ground to start with when we're talking about interfaith dialogue and learning from each other's religion. I think of the meal that I had with during Ramadan in 2019 with some of my Muslim sisters and brothers here, facilitated through the Atlas Foundation here in Baton Rouge, and the commonality of food and how important food is to the Muslim faith, to family life in that religion. And I think about the importance of the Christian meal, the Jesus love, agape love feast of each Sunday. I think about the table fellowship and the blessing of the bread and the wine in the Jewish faith, and I think about the Abrahamic historical roots of all three of those religions, just as a starting point, not to mention the countless cross sections between compassion and meditation and contemplation, which Christian faith through its monastic roots has with the Buddhist faith, for example. There's so much more richness, I think, than we often think, which gives us not just a nice sort of polite starting point, but a real grounded, earthy starting point where we can worship together, where we can eat together, we can laugh and sing together without being threatened, and we can get to know one another as human beings, again, to humanize one another as part of the human family.
Speaking of the earth, you are in Louisiana, and you also are in a community as a region, as a state that has a lot of environmental problems, especially with pollution and air quality and things like that. And I when I was reading your blog, I read a lot of posts that alluded to this environmentally conscious attitude that you have to the earth. I mean, I think that it also, if I remember correctly, influenced your decision to be vegan and you being a vegan, and also how you practice your faith. The fact that we have to be conscious of the earth that we have inherited from God and those different things. So how does it feel to be someone who foregrounds their faith practice as an environmentally, socially conscious person, and then to live in a community where environmental degradation is a commonplace practice? You go 5 miles and there's a chemical plant. Go down the river and there's chemical plants all along the river, and that area is Cancer Alley. How does it feel to live in this region, having this belief and being surrounded by all of this?
It's become a growing important part of why I became initially a vegetarian and then a vegan. I do confess a naive love of animals as a 14-year-old, as a bit of a rebellious teenager. But over time, and particularly the decision to become a vegan at the age of 30, was definitely an environmental one, just as much as a sort of an animal justice and and increasingly a choice of nonviolence, and my belief in pacifism as a way forward for humanity, for all living beings, not just human beings. I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to, as human beings, one way or the other, face and hopefully repent of the violence that is done to our Mother Earth, that sustains us, that we've become so disconnected from. The thing that being a vegetarian and vegan has taught me the most and humbled me the most is that we've become so disconnected from our food source and even what we're eating. And the very fact that I have to read the food label every time I go to the supermarket, the grocery store, it forces me, just a little bit to get a connection to what I'm eating. And hopefully if I have a connection to what I'm eating, I'm getting a connection to the people who got it to the store. And if I've got a connection to the people who got it to the store, I've got a connection to the warehouser and the packer. And eventually I'll get back to the person who grew the food. I remember, for example, visiting a priest in California and learning about her boycott of strawberries in the off season because of the chemical impact of the ripening agent that they use to make the strawberries ripen and turn red, and the negative both environmental impact and the health impact that had on the workers out picking the strawberries. And so eventually I think Louisiana is going to have to grapple with an economy which is going to necessarily need to move away from petroleum, away from the chemical industry, and what that means for the everyday lives of families. I realize that Louisiana is one of the few places you can get a well-paid, pensioned job without a college degree if you go and work in the petroleum or chemical industry. I realize that the investment here is substantial. But I also realize that the tax rates here are much lower than other places on the same types of industry. I realize that the Gulf continues to encroach into the natural wetlands of the state at a horrifying rate. And the budget needed to mitigate that is just a fraction of what it will take. That people will have to relocate as a result of the way that we all have, me included, has chosen, non-reusable items and chosen to, continue to use animal products. That's going to be hard. That I realize that's asking. And that means that I'm asking generations of people who've worked in those industries, that have relied on their livelihood, to make a change. But I think it's possible. I think it's doable. But I know that it will take time. But I just hope it won't come at a time where we're forced to do it rather than choosing as agents of our own future.
That's an interesting point to make, because I actually on yesterday read an article in NOLA.com that talked about, this idea of Louisiana finding alternatives in two places, one being renewable energy and other being international trades. I think the article talked about how, Louisiana really needs to kind of embrace its port status a lot more, because New Orleans is a big, important port for this country, and historically has been, and even for the world. And if Louisiana starts to kind of invest in expanding its port and, investing in, like, for example, a lot of infrastructural makeover, Baton Rouge, in the port Port of Baton Rouge and the Port of Louisiana and the Port of New Orleans, that will bring more jobs because international trade is an evergreen industry. That's how we get a lot of our goods, through cargo ships and container ships. So, and I think that they're working on a project down in Plaquemines Parish to dredge the river about 50 feet. And that small difference would allow for bigger ships to come into New Orleans, and also more ships to come into Baton Rouge and other places, which would strengthen the economy. And I would think that international trade as a port trade is a lot less environmentally damaging, provided you're not like transporting oil or something, than pollution. And then also renewable energy. Because of the pandemic, I would assume a lot of the plants along the river are closing down. So maybe taking that energy and investing it in renewable sources. I mean, we have water everywhere. So water may be a source, solar, those different things. And investing Louisiana's economy beyond oil would allow for Louisiana to not only attract more diversity, but also have a stronger economy, because these industries aren't going anywhere. Eventually we're going to run out of oil, but we're never going to run out of trade. We're never going to run out of the whole idea of international trade. What you said really made me think about that. I have a couple of, no problem. I have a couple of final questions to ask. I have interviewed religious individuals before. I actually interviewed Reverend Ryan, who's the preacher at the Unitarian Church. Yeah. And when I spoke to him, and this is in the interview, so I'm not telling his business, but when I spoke to him in the interview, he talked about how he always wanted to be a minister. He always wanted to be a Unitarian minister. Yeah. Have you always wanted to be a minister and a priest? And what is the one thing that you feel is most impactful about your profession and occupation as a man of God, as a priest?
Yes, short answer is yes. From a very young age, I believe I was talking about it from the age of 5 or 6 in Sunday school. I did have interest being in a teacher as well. I come from a whole family of teachers. And I was avoiding going back to seminary for a number of years. And I almost became a paramedic in all of that as well. And, I like to say that I do all 3 of those things, I teach and I preach and I heal. What I mean is that I bring God's healing. I bring, hopefully, a sense of compassion, integrity, vulnerability. I always say that, I've done a lot of hard work trying to know myself. I'm a true believer in therapy. I wouldn't quite call myself a therapy junkie, but I truly believe that, the therapeutic model continues to be underutilized and undervalued. And the intersection between that and knowing ourselves and knowing how I believe God speaks to us through various people in our lives, that's something that continues to fascinate me, that continues to keep me asking questions, continues to make me want to study more. I'm going back to some master's study this year and looking at the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, who was a radical pacifist. I had a brief time and studied at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Many people don't know that. I was executed in the very last days of the Second World War. He spoke about the cost of discipleship. He spoke about the dangers of cheap grace. And I think, I've had a life which has been complicated enough and challenging enough to realize, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words do ring true, that cheap grace, grace without looking deeply at ourselves, grace without being vulnerable with each other, wearing our heart on our sleeve a little bit, giving away some of our power to the other person. Grace without those things, that just becomes the practice of religion rather than a life of faith,
I know we've really talked about a lot of heavy stuff and a lot of like intellectual things and a lot of very, very complex kind of conversations that we've been having so far. But I feel like I have to ask you this because I have to at least have one silly question.
Yeah, of
so
course.
I asked so when I interviewed someone from Belgium, I asked them about their opinions on Waffle House, since of course Belgium is where waffles. So I know you're a vegan, but have you ever had Outback Steakhouse? And if so, what are your opinions on it?
Well, talk about cultural appropriation. No, I have never been to the Outback Steakhouse. I for many reasons, I grimace when I see their ads, both as a vegan and both as an Australian. I describe myself on Facebook as a Vegemite eating vegan priest. I don't know if you've ever tried Vegemite, but it's not often to the American taste palate. It's very strong. It's a yeast vegetable extract, which sounds sort of revolting. It looks like tar, but it's the staple of any Australian child and into adulthood. So I can encourage you to go and reach out to Amazon and get some Vegemite and try it. And you'll be living just a little bit of the Australian spirit. You do that.
For those of you who are watching me looking down, I was actually looking up Vegemite. And is this it?
That's it. Yeah.
Oh my God. It looks like Nutella.
Lots of Earth Balance, the vegan margarine or butter, and some nice hot toast, and don't put it on too thick. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the next image I saw.
Yeah, there you go. How do you Vegemite? Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta start
I've
small.
never seen.
You gotta start small.
Yeah, I don't think they sell that in America. I mean, I think it says that it's mostly popular in Australia and New Zealand, but I don't think they sell that in this Anglophone part of the world. But another silly question. So a lot of Americans' introduction to Australia, if it's not Hollywood like actors, if it's not Outback, that's stereotypical. I know Outback is so stereotypical. It's just obnoxious. But it's usually through Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter.
Crocodile hunter, yes.
Is he really as popular in America as he is in Australia? Well, let me back up because he's deceased. So I want to put some respect on his name, being he's deceased.
I was going to say that of blessed memory. Yes.
Yeah.
I follow his daughter Bindi Irwin on Instagram. She's pretty well known around the US and very big in Japan, I believe. But Bindi and her mom carry on the Australian the Australian Zoo sort of legacy for Steve Irwin. I think at its heart and at its best, someone like Steve Irwin, or to go back earlier to the 80s, like Crocodile Dundee or someone like that, it captures the idea of Australians being in nature, Australians loving nature. I'd be the first one to admit that I have not been to Uluru, which really grieves me now, much more that I'm living outside the country now that I never went. Because the Australian outback, again, not a steakhouse, but the place, the bush, when you get beyond those regional towns to the expanse of Australian desert, it's a mystical place. It's a place of deep connection with the stars that you can see for the first time, a deep connection with the land, the red, rich, iron-rich soil, and of all these wonderful, beautiful creatures that you'll only see in Australia. And you think of kangaroos and koalas, but then you think of the goanna and the frilly neck lizard and all these other wonderful creatures and snakes and other things that live subsistence living on that land, which is so striking and so unique. I would just commend it to anyone. And I think the first thing I want to do when I get back is to try to go bush, try to get out of the city and see those stars and see that beautiful landscape again.
I mean, with all due respect to the late Steve Irwin, I think we joke about that stereotypical kind of Australian accent that we put on imitating, Steve Irwin, but he is, for many Americans, he was a big introduction. If they weren't alive for the Bee Gees, and their music, he was a very prominent symbol of Australia, and I think that the positive ways in which he's remembered is that he was very much a lover of animals. Like, he loved nature. So when people talk about him in America, we don't say not even close to a bad word about him. Because we number one, we have respect for the dead, and also number two, the legacy of him and his daughter Bendy, it's to respect animals, and to have this curiosity of animals that doesn't involve shooting and hunting animals. It's actually like understanding their habitats, understanding how they live. Even the most scary is he is the crocodile hunter, not the rabbit and kitten hunter, the crocodile hunter. And he was also someone who kind of got into the trenches with some pretty scary animals. And I know another stereotype of Australia is that y'all have some scary animals.
Yes, there is that stereotype. Yes, for sure. It's a large geographical area, the same size almost as the US, and you've got 26 million people there instead of 300 or so million. So you've got a lot of expansive space and a lot of freedom for animals to roam and to live and to explore, and because it was an island nation for so many millennia, it's got a unique diversity of animals that's it's there's no other word, I think, than sacred and special and unique, and something that can really only be, I think, experienced if you can go there yourself. And God willing, once the pandemic ends, we can do some travel and we can explore these wonderful countries.
Well, I had to get those silly questions out of the way.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I can be silly too. I'm not always serious, but I wanted to have at least a couple minutes of silliness, but to kind of bring this conversation full circle and to kind of get into the wrap up of it. I have never been to Australia. I've had friends that have gone, but I've never gone. I've always wanted to go ever since I was a little boy. So since you mentioned this desire to go back home to Australia, tell me, walk me through a tour of Australia or a tour of Brisbane. Where would you take me? Where should I go? Where should I go to experience a very memorable, authentic Australian experience? Not one, kind of jazzed up by Hollywood or, stereotype, an actual authentic Australian experience.
If you're going to fly from the US, you'd most likely fly into Sydney. And then you just spend some time by the harbor. You take a ferry to Manly, for example. It's a massive harbor in Sydney. It's hard to get the scope of it from the pictures you see, the Harbour Bridge or the Opera House. You can take a train out to the Western Sydney and go to the Blue Mountains and go hiking. You could fly up to my hometown of Brisbane and again, get on the water, take the City Cat, which is a public transport catamaran that runs and weaves through the rivers. The river weaves through the city, so you can weave through on the catamaran. And they even have a man-made beach at a place called South Bank in the middle of almost downtown Brisbane, where you can go to the beach and go to the beautiful parks and museums, and they're all free, and experience a lot of great food. And then if you want to go north, you can go to North Queensland. When we think of the Great Barrier Reef, when we think of rainforests, and we think of a lot of silly tourist backpacking culture, a lot of European backpackers up in northern Queensland, and a land of cane fields and really just down to earth, honest, genuine people, who just love to welcome you. And then the beautiful tours of the islands and the snorkeling and whale watching and everything that you can get in Hawaii, but culturally very different, and much more expansive. Everything is big there, like the US. The mainland of Australia is just it's hard to get your head around the space. You go out to get the reef, it takes hours and hours and hours to get out there. So
I'm still wrapping my head around the idea that Australia is almost the same size as the US, and it's literally an island. Like it's like an island. So I'm trying to imagine. I mean, America kind of is that isolated because you have the Pacific on one side and the Atlantic on the other, but y'all are literally like a big island surrounded by water. That is so crazy. It's like, that's crazy. So it's almost, so basically it's almost like instead of Canada and Mexico, you have like ocean, sea, and then another sea. Wow. That's, oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the fact that, in an interview, whether you are giving an interview or be on the other end of an interview for a job or whatever, you always will leave the interview with this feeling of, man, I should have said this. Man, I should have said that. Man, I wish I could have talked about this more. So I want to give you a chance to maybe express or say anything that you haven't had a chance to talk about during the course of the interview. So that way you don't leave with this feeling of, I wish I said this. I wish I had a chance to talk about this. Or maybe there was something that you said that you didn't have a chance to expand on that you wanted to expand upon, or just something that can kind of put a beautiful bow on it and everything.
Well, thank you. I love that. I love giving your guest the final word. It's very hospitable. Thank you. I just really love what you're doing here with these interviews, to be able to talk about roots, to talk about our own history, our own stories. Again, that's the thing that I love about what I get to do every day. I get to be alongside people. I get to hear their stories, sometimes at very silly, jovial, lighthearted moments, but then other really monumentous times like weddings and funerals and moments of crisis with people. Sometimes I feel like I've been dropped down this well of knowing, and go to the heart of what people are all about very, very quickly in our conversations. And so I commend you for encouraging that and fostering that among a diverse range of peoples from all over the world, because that's how I learn, and grow, by reflecting upon my own story and listening to the stories of others and how they diverge or overlap. And so I just really thank you for your time and the opportunity.
No, thank you for expressing yourself and taking the time to hop on and be a part of expanding our roots. But I will have to say that I really appreciate that compliment, because the main thing I wanted to do was to allow for the community locally and globally to see Louisiana in a different way. I've interviewed activists, I've interviewed community leaders, religious leaders, immigrants, refugees, people of so many backgrounds. And I want people to watch the interview series in every episode, or maybe whatever one they choose to watch, and be like, wow, I didn't think Louisiana had people from this country. I didn't think Louisiana did stuff like that. Wow, it's cool what they're doing in Louisiana, because I feel like as though a lot of the issues in Louisiana come because we don't have that self-love. We need a little bit of love for ourselves. And I think that if I can show, and I'm not alone, I'm not the only one doing this, but if I can show the community that there is a lot of beauty in it, diversity, consciousness, all those different things, my hope is that people will feel encouraged enough to be a part of this community in a way that's positive, and also to start embracing and being proud of that diversity and not running away from it. That's the whole point of this interview series. And if I get that across, then I've done my job. If not, then I still have work to do. Well, Father Chris, thank you so much for participating in this interview series and sharing your story and just being a part of this experience and this project. I'm of the understanding that you're in a transitional period right now. So I really hope that that would involve you staying in Louisiana. And if not, then the next community, hopefully in America, or maybe back in Australia, will definitely be happy to have you and your experiences and your wisdom, and also your drive to having people feel closer to God, but also practicing and being a part of a true Christian tradition that is foregrounded in having love and wanting justice for all of God's people. I appreciate that.